MSW Media.
I signed an order appointing Jack Smith.
And nobody knows you.
And those who say Jack is a fanatic.
Mr. Smith is a veteran career prosecutor.
Wait, what law have I broken?
The events leading up to and on January 6th, classified documents and other presidential records.
You understand what prison is?
Send me to jail.
Hello and welcome to Jack, the podcast for all things special counsel. It is Sunday, August 6th, 2023. I'm Allison Gill.
And I'm Andy McCabe. Well, every week we ask what could happen this week. And this week, after only 9 months, Jack Smith's office issued an indictment of Donald Trump on 4 criminal counts related to January 6th. And Trump was arraigned on those charges in federal court in Washington, D.C.
Yes, and he pled not guilty to all 4
startlingly pled not guilty.
With his chin out. No cameras allowed in the courtroom. We'll talk about that a little bit. But that's not all. The new defendant in the Mar-a-Lago classified documents case, Carlos de Oliveira, made his first court appearance, but was not arraigned because, just like Walt Nauta, he still doesn't have local counsel in Florida. Again, we're all shocked. And we learned that the IT guy we've been talking about, Tavares, was the low-level Trump employee that received a target letter after Nauta and Trump were indicted.
And that's still not all, okay? We were right in our predictions last week. So in a court filing this week, DOJ has asked Judge Eileen Cannon to hold a hearing to consider possible conflicts of interest for Stan Woodward, because he is, of course, representing people on both sides of the documents case. He represents Walt Nauta, and he represents a few other people who could be witnesses against Walt Nauta. So we're going to get into all of that a little bit later, but Allison, let's start with the new indictment of Donald Trump. And I know for those of you who are trying to keep score at home, this is number 3 in the past several months. So we're going to go through all of it for you.
Or number 4 if you count superseding indictments.
That's a good point. Good point. Let's call it 4. What is that, like 4 in 4 months? Something like that?
3.5?
Yeah, that sounds about right. Sounds about right. Okay, so this one, as we mentioned, it's 4 charges. The first is a charge based on 18 U.S.C. 371, which is, of course, the fraud against the government conspiracy charge. And that is for the sprawling plot to disrupt the peaceful transfer of power. So I think it's important for people to understand that in the indictment, the prosecutors lay out a long factual narrative. And that long factual narrative, even though it covers several different areas, that forms the basis, the factual basis for all these different charges. So that narrative also refers to, in addition to telling us, of course, what the allegations are against Trump himself, it refers to the actions of 6 co-conspirators who are not identified in the indictment, but with pretty easy investigative skills, you can easily conclude who 1 through 5 are. Mm-hmm. And they are, co-conspirator number 1 is, of course, our friend Rudy Giuliani. Co-conspirator number 2 is attorney John Eastman. Co-conspirator number 3 is attorney Sidney Powell. Co-conspirator number 4 is attorney and former DOJ employee Jeffrey Clark. Co-conspirator 5 is attorney Kenneth Chesebro. And finally, all signs point to Boris Epshteyn as being co-conspirator number 6, but that hasn't been confirmed by anyone at this point. I think the Times has leaned the furthest forward into that. They've kind of determined that an email he sent to Giuliani is referred to in the indictment as having come from co-conspirator 6. So it looks pretty solid for Epshteyn.
Yeah, and Lisa Rubin pointed out that it's not Jason Miller because he's mentioned elsewhere as a campaign staffer in the indictment, and it's not Mike Roman because he's also referred to elsewhere. And there's only, I think, 1 or 2 other lawyers that could have possibly been in a specific meeting that's mentioned in the indictment. And to me, it stands out as Epstein. If Rudy's in here, because Rudy had a 2-day proffer session, Epstein had a 2-day proffer session, it stands out to me as whether they'll be charged or not, depending on whether the DOJ wants their cooperation or not. But I'm leaning Epstein too.
Yeah, for sure. And it's a really interesting move by Jack Smith and his team to only charge Donald Trump here. And as you said, we could have a superseding indictment at some point in this case that would then charge one or several or all of these co-conspirators. We'll have to wait and see on that. So this includes the the 18 USC 371 charge encompasses all these different schemes, essentially. So the fraudulent elector scheme is referred to in great detail. They go through state by state. They also talk about Trump's efforts to try to get the Department of Justice to conduct a sham investigation, or at least notice of a sham investigation through the machinations of Jeffrey Clark in an effort to delay the certification of the vote. They talk at great detail about Trump's campaign of pressuring Mike Pence to try to get him to refuse to certify the vote or to at least delay the proceedings. And finally, they talk about Trump's impact in deceiving a large angry crowd, luring them essentially to attack the Capitol and to target Pence particularly. So all of that stuff qualifies as, according to the prosecutors, supporting a charge for 18 USC 371. So the next charge is one we've talked about a lot. It's 18 USC 1512. If there's a count under subpart K for conspiracy to obstruct the electoral count, and there is also a count under 1512C2 for obstructing an official proceeding. Mm-hmm. That one we all totally predicted, right? That was the one we all expected to see in here. It's been the charge that's been used most frequently against January 6th defendants.
Yeah, exactly. And we picked that up early on when Liz Cheney started using the language from 1512C2. Rachel Maddow kind of grabbed onto it for a second, but she thought it was 1505, which is obstruction of Congress. But the language didn't quite match. So I thought it to be 1512C2. And as time has gone on from 2021, early 2022, we've with all of the 1512C2 charges and the litigating the meaning of 1512C2. And, of course, there's just been so much discussion. We had the Judge Carter in California, who turned over emails to the January 6th committee under the crime fraud exception for 371 and 1512C2, 371 being the first charge that you went over, conspiracy to defraud the United States, and 1512C2, obstructing an official proceeding, those two counts. And there are two counts that the January 6th committee handed over to the Department of Justice as a criminal referral for the president and John Eastman. So it makes a whole lot of sense. We were expecting to see those. And then we weren't sure. Was it going to be 2383, 2384, which is insurrection, seditious conspiracy? Is it going to be nothing else? Is it going to be something else? And bam, he hits us with Title 18 U.S. Code 241. And some folks early on talked about 241, including our friend Joyce Vance. This is under the Klan law. I think Elie Mystal said it best when he said Donald Trump's been indicted under the Klan law more than David Duke.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, they definitely reached deep into the bag of tricks for this one, but I think it's, it makes perfect sense when you look at how it's referred to in the indictment and what they're trying to do.
Yeah, and it's a post-Civil War statute. It was used during Watergate to convict Nixon's top domestic policy advisor, John Ehrlichman, and also, plus, Gordon Liddy and the rest, for a warrantless entry into a doctor's office looking for info to discredit Dan Ellsberg after he leaked the Pentagon Papers. So it's a very pointed statute. We had discussed it last week on the show, Andy, and we were just curious as to how Jack Smith would apply it here, because it's called conspiracy against rights. And we were wondering, would it be a conspiracy against our rights to a peaceful transfer of power, or maybe a conspiracy against Joe Biden's right to ascend to the presidency, or our right to vote? And it turns out he is applying it to the whole of the United States voters. We are now the victims. Every voter in this country is a victim of this crime because it was a conspiracy against our right to cast our vote and have our vote counted in an election.
That's absolutely right. So it's basically a charge that these conspiracies, these schemes, buttressed by lies and undertaken with the help of attorneys to use the law in a way it's not intended to be used, essentially amounted to an effort to dispossess over 80 million people of their right to vote and their right to have their votes lawfully counted, right? So I think it's an appropriate charge. It has incredible historical relevance. The statute that was enacted after the Civil War to go after essentially Ku Klux Klan terrorists, people who were using terrorism to prevent Black citizens from voting. Here, now we're in the modern age, and it is now being used against a sitting president who essentially tried to do the same thing on a mass scale. So I think it has particular resonance for people, and it has a kind of a visceral appeal that I think is really going to get the attention of a jury.
I agree. And this is where I want to bring up why I think these proceedings should be televised. Since there is a conspiracy against rights to prevent our votes from counting and to prevent us from voting, I think that, that clearly makes all of us victims in this crime. And under Title 18 U.S. Code 3771, Crime Victims' Rights, subsection A3 says we have the right to not be excluded from any such public court proceeding unless the court, after receiving clear and convincing evidence, determines that testimony by the victim would be materially altered if the victim heard other testimony at that proceeding. I think, now there are other federal rules of criminal procedure in place that say there are no cameras allowed in the courtroom. I believe it is up to the board of, what is it called? It's like a chief judge, John Roberts sits atop, and it's all of the former or current head
That's
judges.
Like the administrative apparatus for the federal courts. But
Right.
at the end of the day, the bottom line is it's John Roberts' decision.
Right.
John Roberts could change. It is the current rule that there are no cameras in federal courts, period, anywhere in the country. It's not just a DC thing. John Roberts could change that in a half an hour with a memo. I hereby decide, here's what it is. And this is so overdue. This is so long overdue.
It's a 1946
This has been going
rule.
on. Yeah, in hundreds of courtrooms around the country every single day. People get to see civil trials. They get to see criminal trials on occasion. We've proven that this can be done without undermining justice, without denying defendants a fair trial. We are living through a period in which people's respect for and understanding of the works of democracy and of courts in particular, and of the Supreme Court in particular, is experiencing like record lows, right? People are losing confidence in the system and the structures of justice. And to continue to do things in secret for no real practical reason is just, it's the wrong choice. I mean, he's wrong about this.
Well, that, and you're gonna leave a vacuum. You're gonna leave a vacuum to fill with mis and disinformation. We saw it when the DOJ was investigating this whole time. DOJ always says nothing, so that allows Donald Trump and his people to come in and spin it the way they want. And when you have a criminal court proceeding, you know that the Trump lawyers are going to come out and say what they said, what they want to say happened in the courtroom, and the DOJ will not. 100% will not.
Right. And it goes out from there, right? You're going to see every news network putting up some version of what happened in the trial today. And none of them will be perfect on any side of the argument. Why not have the actual trial speak for itself? Look, we saw that happen with the January 6th hearings, right? And tens of millions of people tuned in to watch them. So there's an interest there. There's a need for it. You couldn't have that same sort of disassembling of what had happened and what people said in the hearing that night on the news because people saw it. There was a readily accessible record. And that is so important now. This could very well be the most important criminal trial that's ever taken place in this country. People should be able to see it, listen to it, watch it develop if they wish to do so.
Have you ever been a part of or had under your purview a trial that was televised, that was able to be televised? And is this something where the DOJ can petition? I am assuming the Department of Justice could petition the Supreme Court to do this, or that body, maybe write a letter. I'm not sure what that would look like, or perhaps file a motion with the court and have it travel up to where it needs to travel. But also Trump's lawyer is asking for this to be televised, and we have that on the record. So you can't really unwind that or put that tube back in the toothpaste. And, they're not going to come back and say, never mind, we don't want it we don't want it televised. But I would love it if the DOJ again would call their bluff and file something asking for cameras to be allowed in the courtroom.
Yeah, I've never been involved in a case that was, because I only worked in the federal system, and it doesn't happen anywhere in the federal system. I think it is notable, though, like it never happened in the Supreme Court either until during COVID, they started making audio recordings of the arguments. And they are continuing to do that because they've learned that it was a helpful and meaningful thing. And so like that process alone shows them that like it's time to update the way we think about doing business. How you would actually do it, I think it's unlikely that the government, especially in the middle of a pending matter, would essentially advocate for that sort of a policy change, because the government never wants to create the impression that they're trying to change the rules of the game in the middle of the game. So I think that's unlikely. I guess, I don't know what the procedure would be to get the issue in front of that board. Presumably the defense could do that, and the government could then weigh in and say, we have no objection, which would be in and of itself a very powerful statement. Yeah,
or a joint letter.
Yeah, so I don't know. I find it unlikely simply because it's never happened, but it should happen. Here, it's never been more necessary than in this case.
Yeah, and there are arguments against televising it. I heard somebody arguing, saying, look, this isn't a circus type situation. I just wanted to put that argument out there. I disagree with it respectfully. But 99.9% of the people that I'm hearing from, experts up and down, are wanting this televised. Yep. Also, Andy, you and I are going to be reading this indictment as a free bonus episode. We're just going to read it to you, and we're going to substitute the conspirators' names in, thanks to Just Security and Ryan Goodman for putting together a annotated, searchable version of this indictment. The first one was not searchable, and it drove everybody crazy.
So frustrating.
We're looking for names. We're looking for chief of staff. We're looking for whatever we can find. It's not searchable. So they made it searchable, and they substituted co-conspirator 1 with Rudy Giuliani, for example. That's the version we're going to read. You can get that excellent searchable resource for yourself at Just Security. But we need to take a quick break. We're going to come back. We're going to talk about possible defenses and the arraignment. So everybody stick around. We'll be right back. Welcome back, everyone. I want to talk for a second about a potential defense that I want your opinion on, Andy. And I guess it's not really a defense. I think it's looking down the road to an appeal. On a few different cable news networks, Trump lawyer Lauro, who's not a terrible lawyer, came out. I'm comparing relatively with other Trump lawyers. He's not a co-conspirator.
He seems like he knows what he's talking about, which is in some respects remarkable. But anyway.
And now he went on several networks and said Trump all he wanted was a 10-day delay for the Electoral Count Act. And everybody kind of lost their mind. Like, oh my God, he just confessed to trying to delay the Electoral Count Act, which is a coup, right? That is the crux of the 1512c2 charge. And everybody kind of lost their mind. Well, remember, you and I have talked at length about Virginia Governor Bob McDonnell. Mm-hmm. He was convicted of bribery. And in 2016, on appeal, the Supreme Court tossed out his conviction, saying the corruption statute was vague or ambiguous or too broad. And they really narrowed that bribery statute. And now it's virtually impossible to convict anybody or charge them with bribery in public corruption, because now you have to basically, as we've said before, you have to be like, hello, Mr. Senator, take this bag of cash, and in exchange, I would like for you to vote on this marijuana legislation this way. And then they have to say, understood, I'm accepting this cash in exchange for, it's got to be like...
It's got to be explicit quid pro quo. It used to be, hey, you voted this way. This guy asked you, told you how he wanted you to vote. You voted that way. And then a month later, he let you drive his Ferrari for the weekend. Mm-hmm. And you could connect those things as like an implicit bargain. Yeah. And they basically said, no, it has to be a perfectly clear quid pro quo, one thing for the other thing.
Yeah. So SCOTUS tossed out that conviction. That was 2016. And in January of 2022, think about that. That's a year and a half ago. I tweeted, quote, Susan Collins seems to be trying to give Donald a pass here by saying that the Electoral Count Act is ambiguous. No, it isn't. I went on to say we have to put do not eat labels on deodorant, not because it's complicated to use, but because of the 4 people who are too dumb not to eat it.
Wait a minute, you can't eat that? Oh my God.
That's my little analogy there for the coup. Thank you. Then on February 1st, a couple days later, same year, 2022, Manu Raju tweeted, when asked about Trump's statement that Pence should have overturned the election, Portman told me, well, we need to clarify how the Electoral Count Act works. When asked if he had concerns with the Trump statement, he said, well, it's very confusing right now, and that's why it needs to be clarified. I quote tweeted that, saying, I bet you Republicans are going to say the reason the January 6th committee is looking to shore up the Electoral Count Act is because it's somehow confusing or ambiguous. This helps Donald set up a defense that he didn't know Pence couldn't just delay for 10 days. Don't listen. Now, I think Trump's attorneys know he's going to be convicted. I do, Andy.
Yeah, it's a tough indictment. It's a tough indictment.
It's pretty airtight. And I think they're setting up to appeal and get their case in front of this Supreme Court and argue that the Electoral Count Act was vague and ambiguous and try to narrow it, just like Bob McDonnell did with the Corruption and Bribery Act. Now, even Eastman admitted in a crime fraud accepted email that they would lose this case. Well, first he said 7-2, but then he said 9-0. But they don't really have any other viable defense. But, well, they're trying a few things. But, it is of note. You remember who prosecuted Bob McDonnell?
I do, and his name is Jack Smith. I mean, I think you've hit on a really good issue, which is, to be fair, this is not an unheard of defense tactic, right? The defense, in addition to thinking through and lining up potential defenses to use at trial, they also raise issues at trial to just plant them like landmines in the case, so that in the event that their client is convicted, they can go back to those little things and try to use them to overturn the conviction after the fact. So, this is a great example of one of those. If you try to bring the Electoral Count Act into the case, which quite frankly, I think is very hard to do because none of the charges really have anything to do with it. They could try to get, their goal will be to get the conviction in front of the Supreme Court on some grounds on the hope, the Hail Mary, pass hope that the court will find a reason to overturn the conviction. So it's a super long shot strategy, but it is one of many that they'll deploy here. We've already seen them kind of air out a few potential defenses on TV and in commentary and things like that. One of them is this, I was just following the advice of counsel. Somehow, if you just, if your lawyer tells you to do something, it somehow gives you this cloak of invisibility or something that you can't then be held responsible for what you did because some lawyer told you to do it. It does not work that way.
The judge determined that it wasn't attorney-client privilege because of the crime fraud exception.
It just doesn't work that way. And there's a bunch of problems with it. The first is when your lawyers are counseling you to do things that they're telling you are violating the law, which is what John Eastman did. He explained, and there's a great quote in the indictment where he says, it'll just require a slight violation of the Electoral Count Act. And then goes on to, say, please do it. That doesn't get you there. It also would require Trump two things. One, to testify in his own defense. He'd have to put that defense on himself by testifying, which would open up such a terrible can of worms for him on a million other counts, because then he would get cross-examined likely for a week by some very skillful prosecutors. And Trump's lawyers know, like, he can't take the stand here. It would be deadly. So there's that. And also,
you have to waive all the attorney-client privilege too, don't you?
Yes, you've made an issue of what your lawyer told you to do. And therefore, to just get that issue in court, you have to waive attorney-client privilege with that lawyer. So that opens the floodgates to then you have to testify about all these conversations you had with your lawyer. So these are bad things. So that's one that I don't think is a real defense.
Well, let me ask you a question about the attorney-client privilege or the advice of counsel. 4 of these 6 co-conspirators are facing disbarment. Does that play into this as well?
I mean, it's not a good fact. Lawyers are always talking about good facts and bad facts. Good facts that support their case and bad facts make their case look terrible. I'd say that's a bad fact, although I don't think it has particular legal significance. And a lot of those proceedings will be going on forever.
I think it would be important for a jury to hear, though, right?
Yeah, because I don't know if you could get it in front of the jury, because it's one of those things that if its relevance is low and its kind of inflammatory effect on the jurors is high. And so that's that balancing that judges do to sometimes decide to keep evidence out. So the other defense has been talked about a lot that I don't think really gets them anywhere. Is this First Amendment defense that, the Justice Department is criminalizing the former president's exercise of his First Amendment rights and his, nothing's more protected than political speech. This was all political speech. And this is proof that Joe Biden is actually doing this to keep him out of the election. La, 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 la. Well, as a legal matter, and we'll talk about the political in just a second, but as a legal matter, the First Amendment defense doesn't really work because they're basically saying, hey, anything I say that has any sort of political relevance is completely protected and cannot possibly form the basis of a crime. That's not true. What's criminalized here, or what he's being charged with, is not the statements in the abstract sense. It's the fact that it's not the things he said, it's the things that he did.
His behaviors, right.
He participated in the scheme to enlist fake electors to undermine the counting of the votes. He participated in conversations with state level officials in an effort to push them and coerce them into changing their own state results, changing the counting of the votes, finding new votes for him, things like that. He participated in conversations where he tried to coerce Mike Pence into not certifying the election. So what you're criminalizing is conduct, not speech. And the other thing I would point out is the criminal law penalizes speech all the time. It's not protected speech to coerce someone or cheat them out of money. Every fraud in the criminal code requires some element of speech. So if I call you up, Allison, and I tell you a lie in order to convince you to send me your money, that's wire fraud. It's not protected speech. The lie that I told you to scheme you out of your money is not protected speech. If I threaten you for the purpose of causing you to give me something of value, that threat is not protected by the First Amendment. It is part of the crime of extortion. And what he's done, according to this indictment, he used speech. He lied to people, he pressured them, he coerced them, he participated in putting together these illegal efforts to send fake electors forward as a part of an effort to steal the election. So that is not First Amendment protected speech on any grounds.
No, and if he had charged inciting an insurrection under Title 18 U.S. Code Section 2383, there would be a First Amendment argument.
Much tougher.
Much like there was in the second impeachment hearing of Donald Trump. He also has a double jeopardy defense, which is hilarious because the Senate tried him for this and acquitted him, and he thinks that somehow impeachment trials apply to double jeopardy. I think that might just be bluster and probably won't end up in a court filing, but who knows? I'm pretty sure that if they did, it would end up in a granted motion in limine to remove that as a defense.
The other one that I want to debunk quickly is this thing that people are throwing out there like, well, what if he truly believed the election had been stolen from him? So he was acting under that. He was acting honestly under this misbelief, essentially. Also, maybe relevant in some way, but it's not determinative of the case. So the mental state, the mens rea that you have to prove with every crime, in these crimes is knowing and willful. It's not that he believed he lost the race and now he was doing these things to undermine that result. It's that he knowingly and willfully engaged in this conduct. Mm-hmm. He knowingly and willfully engaged in the scheme to put together the fake electors, or he knowingly and willfully engaged in pressuring Mike Pence. It doesn't matter whether he actually thought the election had been stolen from him or he knew he lost and he was just flat out trying to steal it. That would be like saying, George Conway.
I was just going to bring up George Conway's example with OJ. Is that what you were about to go to?
Yeah, I was sitting on the panel with him when he laid that out there. And I was like, that is brilliant, George.
Wasn't it? Yeah.
OJ, in his slightly less famous second case, the one that he went to jail on, he believed that his memorabilia had been stolen from him. And he found out that there were people in a hotel who had the stuff. And so he went over to get it back. I think, honestly believed that his stuff had been illegally taken from him. So he went into that hotel room with a gun and he held everybody at gunpoint and took all of his stuff back. The fact that he legitimately believed that his stuff had been stolen doesn't make the assault with a deadly weapon any less criminal. So that's why he went to jail. I don't know if he's still in jail or not, but nevertheless. Trump's belief in whether or not he won or lost, it's going to be interesting to the jury to hear all this evidence that he actually knew he didn't win. I expect that they're going to spend a lot of time putting witnesses on who said, I told him that he lost. I told him there was no fraud. And these will be strong Republican witnesses, White House counsel, people like that. So that you'll hear that. But what he believed in terms of the election is not determinative.
Agreed. Let's talk about the arraignment really quick, and then a DOJ filing that happened, I think, with less than 24 or 48 hours after the arraignment. He was all by himself on this indictment, right? We talked about that. That's probably for speed because Jack Smith has asked for a speedy trial, which is a 70-day endeavor. Things get told for certain reasons.
Right.
And they send those updated reports about how many days have passed in the speedy, on the speedy trial clock and how many days have been told. We saw a report like that in the documents case. So he's asked for a speedy trial here. And normally, like we said, it's a defendant that asks for a speedy trial. But here he's asking on behalf of the American people and in the interest of the public for a speedy trial, because it's our right to have one as well. We're all victims. Judge Tanya Chutkin has drawn the case. She's a formidable, amazing, fair judge. She's an Obama appointee. She's commented on presidents not being kings before in her courtroom when dealing with January 6th cases from, the boots on the ground attack on the Capitol. She's Jamaican born, and I am counting down the seconds before Trump brings that up and starts doing some weird racist thing about that. But she came from Kingston and then, came here, went to law school and became a judge.
She was a really accomplished defense attorney, which is a little bit different. You see a lot of people with prosecutorial backgrounds going onto the bench. She was a public defender in DC for a long time. She's got tons of trial experience. She worked in the private sector for a while as a defense attorney and has a reputation of being Very smart, no nonsense, moves the cases forward. By all accounts, a good judge.
And unlike Amit Mehta, her sentencing for January 6th, folks, has been close to or above the recommendations for the sentencing guidelines handed down by the Department of Justice. So we'll see how that goes, because we know that Merrick Garland has dropped a note saying he plans to appeal the Oath Keepers sentences handed down by Judge Amit Mehta for coming in 8 years under the 25-year recommended sentencing. And even more in some cases. I think somebody was recommended for 12 and he gave him 4. Like, he's coming in way under.
Way low. Yeah.
And I expect to see that appeal filed now at any day because Jack Smith has asked for the speedy trial. We'll see what happens there. Maybe they're not connected. Maybe I'm just connecting them in my head, but they're all charged with 1512C2. So
be nice to have that resolved before we get there, but we'll see.
It would be. Now, Trump pled not guilty to all charges. No surprise there. Jack Smith was there. As well as some judges came in and sat in the front row, including Chief Judge Boasberg, Judge Amy Berman Jackson, Judge Beryl Howell. Now,
that's remarkable. That never, ever happens. I've never seen another judge just come walking in and sitting in the gallery of a different judge's proceeding, trial, and certainly not arraignments. Arraignments are like boring. Like, it's the same every time. You don't really expect fireworks, but yeah, incredible that they showed up.
Historic moment. It's a truly historic moment in the United States. He's out on bail. The conditions include not speaking to witnesses, same basic conditions that they had down in the Mar-a-Lago case. He's not allowed to speak to witnesses about the facts of the case. The magistrate judge that presided over the arraignment spoke to Judge Chutkan and reminded Trump specifically, you can't commit any crimes while you're out on bail. Just want you to know that. And sometimes I hear that, but not in every case. But it was brought up specifically in this case. And also, the magistrate judge said that Judge Chutkan has set the next hearing, or they set the next hearing for August 28th. They had 3 picked, and of course, the Trump lawyers picked the latest, the furthest away date, which is August 28th. But the discussion with Chutkan, they gamed this out ahead of time, saying, hey, what if he doesn't show up? And so what they've decided to say is, if Trump can't make it, you don't have to be there, pal. I'm having this hearing to set the trial date, and you don't have to be there. Seems like she's prepared for his delay shenanigans.
And it also kind of, it's like she's doing him a favor. Hey, I'll let you out of this one. So it's an easy way to put one in the I'm nice to you box, right? Mm-hmm.
But also, you're not going to delay this. Have a nice day. I assume Jack Smith has all discovery ready to go, same as the Mar-a-Lago case. Each party has 5 days to file a brief asking for the trial date of their choosing. Now, Jack Smith, like I said 70 days in court. Trump's lawyers asked for 3.5 years from now.
And they asked for that based on a miscalculation of how long the investigation has been going on. They said, well, they've had 3.5 years to investigate, not figuring out that 3.5 years is long before January 6th, but whatever.
Mm-hmm. And Alvin Bragg, as we know, you and I have talked about this. He has said publicly he'd be willing to give up his March trial date in the interest of justice, which is pretty plain language for in case the DOJ wants to go in March. And they might take him up on that. But hey, December's also free. The documents case wasn't scheduled in December. So, hey, I think my money, and I am a betting person. You know me. I speculate all over the place. I think Jack Smith will ask for December with eyes on March. That's what I think. And we'll see how that goes. His co-conspirators have not been indicted yet, as you said. So we'll see what happens. But also, then Trump tweeted, or truthed, which is also under federal criminal investigation, his Truth Social DWAC SPAC thing, and how that was funded by rubles, probably. Anyway, I digress. Back to what he truthed on Truth Social. He said, if you come after me, I'm coming after you, in all caps. And then within hours, DOJ put a filing in for a protective order, not a gag order, a protective order over discovery, meaning all the evidence we're going to hand over, just like we did down in Florida for the documents case. All the evidence we wanted under a protective order because dissemination of that evidence seems likely here. And then they included that post to, if you come after me, I'm coming after you in this filing, I think to get Judge Chutkin's eyes on it above anything else. And we'll see how Judge Chutkin will respond. I am 100% sure she's going to grant a protective order for the discovery. But what do you think? I think, because we're talking about avoiding First Amendment arguments here up and down the line. We saw Department of Justice in the arraignment of Donald Trump down in Florida. They were like, we don't have any bail conditions, none. And it was the judge who was like, maybe you should have some. And they were like, okay, cool. I don't think they're going to try to the DOJ is going to try to get a gag order here. I'm not sure what the judge would do, but I think they'll probably avoid that kind of the same way Judge Amy Berman Jackson did with Roger Stone. Let him go. And then finally was like, all right, with the crosshairs, you've clearly now violated or you're stepping over the line here. Well, how do you think this is going to play out?
I think you're right. I think that the First Amendment issue is clearly a third rail here, right? Jack Smith, I think, intentionally wrote this indictment with an eye on staying away from anything that could raise a legitimate First Amendment defense. He put in one of the very first paragraphs of the indictment, he makes it very clear that this doesn't have any, Trump has the right to say whatever he wants and has the right to lie if he chooses to do so and engage in political speech. So that kind of set the tone here. Jack Smith's team's got to protect the evidence in this case. So asking for the protective order for the sake of protecting the discovery, the evidence that is turned over to the defense in discovery, is a totally legit thing to do. But it also, as you said, gives him an opportunity to put that post in front of the judge's eyes. We also know that the judges in both cases are sensitive to Trump's nonsense. Like you said, in the Mar-a-Lago case, it was the court that said, don't you want to ask me to prohibit him from speaking to witnesses? So the judge is already thinking like, this guy has a history of trying to influence people improperly. In this case, you get the judge, the magistrate judge saying, be careful not to commit any more crimes while you're out on your own recognizance.
And you don't have to show up for the hearing where I scheduled the trial date. So yeah.
So they know, they're familiar with what who they're dealing with here. I think I can't see a gag order coming in unless he just goes totally over the line and starts clearly and unambiguously calling for violence, whether that's violence towards the prosecutors or the judge or any witness or anyone really. At that point, a gag order would be pretty called for, I guess. But until you get there, I think everybody knows you're just going to have to hold their noses and keep moving forward.
Yeah, I mean, we saw a picture of him with a baseball bat next to Alvin Bragg, and there's no gag order. So, it's got to be really, really over the line. You just don't want to touch that 1A stuff. Anyway, we need to take a quick break before we head down to Florida. So everybody stick around. We have a whole other case we have to talk about. So stick around. We'll be right back.
Welcome back. Okay, AG, let's head down to Florida and touch base with what's been happening in the Mar-a-Lago documents case. This week we had Carlos de Oliveira, who appeared in court for his arraignment. And once again, you have a Mar-a-Lago defendant shows up without a lawyer. Must be like a real shortage of lawyers down there in Florida. It's so obvious what's happening here. Walt Nauta pulled this nonsense when he was originally indicted with Trump in the first indictment. It bought them like a month, right? Because then, of course, when he was scheduled to come down with his lawyer, he got stuck on a plane in New York, and it was all that nonsense. So De Oliveira does the same thing, shows up with no local counsel. He asked for an August 25th arraignment. So please give me another month, essentially, to find a local lawyer. And the judge didn't put up with it. She moved the arraignment back to August 10th. So we'll see what happens on round 2. If he inexplicably travels to New York and can't get a flight home because of bad weather, I'm going to start to think something's really going on here. So in addition to that delay, we also had Yuscil Tavares.
I'm sorry, can you imagine climate change is a hoax, but it is preventing me from showing up to court?
The Supreme Court must intervene on climate change. Okay. Yuscil Tavares, Mar-a-Lago employee who oversees the property's surveillance cameras. It turns out Tavares received a target letter from federal prosecutors after Donald Trump was first indicted in June. So likely as a result of that target letter, Tavares met with investigators following the initial indictment in the classified docs case and provided information. Once the indictment was issued, Tavares changed lawyers. Now, this is really interesting because so far he's the first person that we know of that's broken free of the Trump legal team, I'll call it. These are the collection of lawyers who are all being paid for, we believe, by the Save America PAC. He's the first one to really split off, get his own counsel. And as a result, he has not found himself under indictment yet. And he is likely in an agreement to provide information to the federal government. So it's interesting. It reminds us, of course, of Cassidy Hutchinson. Cassidy Hutchinson in her bombshell testimony in front of the January 6th committee ultimately revealed she went through a similar process. She had lawyers provided to her by the Trump team, a lawyer by the name of Stefan Passantino. She eventually broke away from Passantino because it was pretty clear that he was not representing her according to her best interest, but rather in an effort to protect Trump. So I don't know, what's your thoughts about these developments from Mar-a-Lago?
I wasn't surprised, first of all, that that De Oliveira didn't have local counsel. That just is the game that they're going to play until this is over. And
it's the dog ate my homework version of the documents case
in all the cases. But yeah, I am very interested in because here we have Tavares who didn't have rights to their surveillance footage, right? He didn't have the administrative rights to it. And he is not indicted here. And I think that shows all the way up to Walt Nauta, like, hey, if you talk, get a better lawyer, Dick Stanley Woodward, get a better lawyer and, tell them what happened. You might not go to jail, or you could go to jail for a lot less, a lot fewer years. But the other thing here is, much like in the January 6th committee hearings, when we found out the troubling information about Passantino and Cassidy Hutchinson, if there was any undue pressure put on Tavares by Stanley Woodward, who is a Trump PAC paid lawyer, like you said, he can now give that information to Jack Smith. Now, it's real hard to, I think, prosecute those kinds of crimes, but it possibly could be referred to the bar or, something else. But if we've got a flipper who had to change lawyers, if there was any undue pressure on him to say, I don't recall, or to change his testimony or his answers to investigators, Jack Smith's going to have that information now, just like the January 6th committee had that information about Passantino and Cassidy Hutchinson.
Yeah, and though it's probably unlikely that information would lead to a criminal investigation, what it could do is give the special counsel team more leverage in bringing these motions in front of the judge to review potential conflicts of interest. They would share that information as like, here's why you should be concerned about this lawyer representing multiple people on different sides, because we know that in the case of this person, Tavares, there are allegations of divided loyalties, what have you. So it's definitely relevant. The other thing that's fascinating to me about this, Allison, is like the part of the story that we don't know about De Oliveira and Tavares. We know about the furtive meeting in the AV room, through the tunnel with the flashlights, whatever, which is great. And we know that Tavares says, I can't do it. I don't have the rights to delete the server. And then De Oliveira says, well, the boss wants it. So what are we going to do? What we don't know is what they actually did.
Yeah, the story ends right there, right?
So
and Tavares
the story continues. We just don't have it yet.
Tavares got it ends in the indictment that we know about. And Tavares got a target letter for obstruction. So he did something wrong right at the end of that conversation, and we don't know what it is yet.
Well, and so it also dovetails with this is why we've been saying for months, the special counsel is really focused on this issue of the video surveillance and did they actually get an unedited, full copy of the footage or not. Tavares can unlock that whole mystery for them and probably has already. And if what actually happened doesn't really put Tavares in that bad of a light, like he actually stood up and said, hey, I can't do this, I'm not doing it,
Well, he might have said, I mean, I just can't do it because I don't have the login to do it.
Yeah, who knows? I mean, we don't know. Or he might have said, hey, I can't do it, but this guy, get on the phone with so-and-so.
Calamari Jr. And we do have text messages with Calamari Jr.
Right. So he facilitates it, but doesn't really have his hands on it. So he's like at a different level of culpability. The other problem that I've always had with the De Oliveira indictment is, how is it, like, what's the government prepared to do if De Oliveira walks in and says, yeah, my boss called me, said, get the server deleted. I don't know about a subpoena. I don't know about a court order. I don't know about nothing. All I know is I work for him. He asked me to delete the server, which in and of itself, by itself, outside the context of the subpoena, is not illegal. It's not illegal to delete your server. So how do you prove, try to hold him, accountable for obstruction? How do you prove that he actually knew why he was being asked to take those steps? And Tavares can likely add more texture to that exchange that they had that firmly puts De Oliveira in the grease. They've got to have some information.
Well, there was that 24-minute phone call between Trump and De Oliveira, and this, I guess, quote unquote cooperation of Tavares will pressure De Oliveira to start cooperating with the government, because if they can get the content of that 24-minute conversation, I mean, this indictment's already a lock, but that would
be very damning to
put
Trump.
It into outer space for Donald Trump. Exactly.
Right, yeah.
All right, we want to talk a little bit about that DOJ, that Department of Justice filing for the conflict of interest because of Stanley Woodward representing multiple people on different sides. But we have to take one last quick break. We'll be right back. Stick around. Everybody, welcome back. Andy, you and I talked last week about there being a pretty clear conflict of interest, right? Now that Tavares seems to be cooperating at least a little bit with special counsel, and that he had the same lawyer as Walt Nauta. That's Stanley Woodward. We've talked about him a lot. He seems to be the new Passantino.
Yes.
And, we talked about him quite a bit with the Cassidy Hutchinson thing in the last segment. But this is from Hugo Lowell at The Guardian. He's confirmed a lot of things that we were sort of assuming. Federal prosecutors requested a hearing to inform Walt Nauta about his lead lawyer's potential conflicts of interest stemming from his defense of at least 3 witnesses that could testify against Nauta and the former president. One is described as someone who worked in the White House during Trump's presidency and then subsequently worked for Trump at Mar-a-Lago. Another is someone who worked for Trump's re-election campaign and worked for Trump's political action committee. I think that might be that Wiles person.
Susie Wiles, maybe.
After Trump's presidency ended. And so, there's now 3 potential witnesses that could testify against Nauta, including Tavares, right? The prosecutors made the request to U.S. District Court Judge Aileen Cannon on Wednesday, explaining Nauta's lead lawyer, Stan Woodward, represents 2 key Trump employees and formerly advised the Mar-a-Lago IT guy, that's Tavares, who is cooperating. Now, quote, and Hugo Lowell says he is cooperating here in this case. Whether there's a formal cooperation agreement, I don't know if I've seen that, but he is cooperating. All 3 of these witnesses, quote, may be witnesses for the government at trial, raising the possibility that Mr. Woodward might be in the position of cross-examining past or current clients. So this is called a Garcia hearing. Can you explain what that is?
Sure. So the purpose of this hearing is not really, people tend to look at it as like, oh, this is the government trying to take out one of the defense attorneys. And in some cases, that's the result. But really what the government has an obligation to bring to the court's attention that a witness or defendant might be being represented by someone who has a conflict of interest. And so if the judge agrees to the request for this hearing, they bring the defendants in and the lawyers, but the purpose is to let the judge, the independent, party, explain to the defendants what the potential conflicts are, and to give the defendants an opportunity to either say, I want a new lawyer, that concerns me, I think I should get a new lawyer, or they can say, I understand that these potential conflicts exist and I'm prepared to waive them. And then that way, later, especially if one of these people who needs this advice is a defendant in the case, if they are, and they decide to waive the conflict, and then they get convicted, they can't come back later and appeal and say, oh, I should have had a different, my lawyer had a conflict of interest and I didn't know, la, la, la. So it's really...
So that's the waiving of conflict of interest is what
that's the point of the hearing, to explain the conflicts to the defendant or witness who's implicated by the multiple representations by one attorney, and to get a waiver if that's necessary and chosen by the person.
Oh, I see. Now, Hugo Low confirms that after Trump and Nauta were indicted, Tavares changed lawyers, swapped out Woodward, and he did confirm that the legal bills are being paid by the Save America PAC. Now, later on, Tavares decided to share more evidence with prosecutors about how Nauta and Mar-a-Lago maintenance worker De Oliveira asked him to delete the surveillance footage. And that's the basis, according to Hugo Lowell here, that formed the basis of the superseding indictment. The court filing said Tavares told prosecutors he is not opposed to Woodward continuing to represent Nauta, but he didn't consent to Woodward using or disclosing his confidential deliberations in the course of defending Nauta.
Yeah, this is really interesting. So we talked about how the hearing is really for the protection of the witness or the defendant. On the other side of this equation is the lawyer. And lawyers are expected to police their own conflicts of interest. And one of the things that a lawyer cannot do, lawyers get confidential information from their clients all the time. That's the basic relationship you have with your lawyer. If you are representing two individuals in the same matter, you can't use confidential information that you receive from one client to the disadvantage of another client. And nowhere is this more relevant than in a criminal case. So like here, if Woodward continues to represent Nauta and Yuscil Tavares ends up as a witness for the government, Tavares will take the stand and provide information, presumably against Nauta. Then Woodward will have an opportunity to cross-examine Nauta, to undermine Nauta in front of the jury, to accuse him of being a liar or not credible or whatever.
Now that seems like it poses a lot of potential danger for the case.
It was almost impossible for Woodward to cross-examine Tavares in that hypothetical without using information that he had gotten from Tavares. Right? He's straddling both sides of the case in that moment. So it's hard for me to understand how a judge would even allow a defendant or a witness to waive a conflict that is so significant.
Yeah.
And sometimes they don't. Sometimes they'll say, no, I can't countenance this. You need to go get a new lawyer, or you need to go get a new lawyer.
We saw that with the Fani Willis and the fraudulent electors when they weren't offered their immunity deal. And it says right here in the DOJ filing about that cross-examination scenario, it raises two principal dangers. They say, first, the conflict may result in the attorney's improper use or disclosure of the client's confidences, which is what you said. But also, on the flip side, the conflict may cause the attorney to pull his punches. So it's kind of for both, like for the for the betterment of both sides there.
Imagine in his prior consultation with Tavares tells Woodward some like, hey, I got convicted of fraud once before, right? So that's like really goes to your quality of being a truth teller, truth and veracity, all that kind of stuff. So now Tavares takes a stand against his client Nauta. So Woodward's got to make a decision. Do I bring up Tavares's prior fraud case and just eviscerate him in front of the jury? To do so would be using the information he gave me against him, which is a violation of the attorney ethics. Or I choose not to do that because I don't want to violate his rights. And by not doing it, I'm now not representing Nauta as vigorously as I possibly could. So it's, I don't know how you resolve
the very definition of conflict of interest
without violating somebody's interest.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting that Tavares was fine with Woodward's. I would not be fine with that. I'd be like, no, out, peace out, bro. But it is up to the judge. It'll be up to the judge here.
Right, that's right. And he might could change his mind on that. But it's an interesting thing that is going to come up again and again. You have, in the January 6th case, you have Todd Blanche, right, who is Trump's primary attorney. also previously represented Boris Epstein, who might be co-conspirator number 6. And Epstein could end up serving as a witness in the case against Trump. So how does Todd Blanche cross-examine Boris Epstein after having prior been his attorney and received confidential information from him? So it's going to happen again in both of these cases.
Yeah, because it's a small lawyer world over there in Trump land. And also prosecutors said there will be additional conflicts for Woodward in this DOJ filing because there are 8 total witnesses that were ensnared by the grand jury investigation. And also one last little piece, Hugo Lowell confirmed that Nauta and Trump are in an informal joint defense agreement. Okay. That seems like true.
If it's informal, that means it'll only last as long as Nauta brings him a warm Diet Coke instead of a cold one.
And before we get to our listener question, we just have some breaking news. Back up to the D.C. charges. Judge Chutkan has ordered Donald Trump to respond to the DOJ's protective order filing, the one that included that Truth Social post, by 5 p.m. Monday.
All right.
So she's not messing around on timelines here.
Keeping everything on a short string. That's good to see. So she's going to get right on this week. That'll be interesting.
Yeah, definitely. All right. Listener questions. If you have a question for Andy or I, you can send it to us at hello@MuellerSheWrote.com. Make sure to put Jack in the subject line. That is how we sort these emails. What do we have this week, Andy?
All right, Allison. So this one comes to us from someone whose name and location I did not get. So I'm going to call this very nice person from somewhere. And you'll see why I call them that, because it begins with, first off, you both rock. And then the emoji for
headbanging emoji.
Headbanging right on sort of hands. So I'm loving that. And by the way, you want to get your question on the air to flatter the host is like one of the best ways to do it. Okay. So this person says, I have a question about sentencing. You've taught me that one of the factors a judge considers when sentencing is whether or not the defendant has previously been convicted of a crime. So let's say Trump ends up convicted in all 3 cases against him. Can a judge wait to see if there's convictions in other cases before sentencing, or postpone sentencing, or revisit a sentence later to take that into account? So
That's
good question.
Yeah, when do you have to be convicted and sentenced by to count for it to count in the sentencing guidelines as a previous conviction? Yeah,
so I guess the first thing to say is that judges have enormous discretion over lots of things, but particularly scheduling things like sentencing hearings, and they can delay that for weeks, months, even years. Sometimes I've seen cooperators go years before they get sentenced.
Oh yeah,
because they're continuing to cooperate.
Joel Greenberg, right down there in the old Matt Gaetz case.
Yeah, there you go. Good example. So you could just delay it until the conviction or the sentence from the other thing comes in. The second thing they do is after you're convicted, either by guilty plea or at trial, there's always a period of time before you get sentenced. And during that period of time, the judge has the probation department put together a pre-sentencing report. And that report really covers everything that the judge might need to consider. It's biographical details. It's all kinds of things about your job and your career and your family structure, whatever, what kind of support you have in life. Also, it includes a very detailed chronology of your past criminal history. And so that would clearly indicate to the judge that there were other ongoing pending matters. So as a baseline matter, when the judge is thinking about sentencing, if they're sentencing you on the single only criminal matter you've ever dealt with, that's one frame of mind. If this is just one of 4 other or 3 or however many other ongoing criminal matters, that's a very different frame of mind for the judge. So that's a way they can kind of informally kind of put that into the equation. And then finally, there's also possible that a lot of judges are like, hey, I'm only ruling on the thing in front of me. I'm not waiting for anybody else. And so it's possible they could disregard it entirely. So it's really, I know that's a very lawyerly response. It's open-ended. Each one of these situations is very different, very fact-dependent. But I can't imagine that any judge would sentence Donald Trump without a strong understanding of all the other legal trouble he currently faces.
That makes sense to me. Yeah, I also wonder, like, just about when you go in and you look at the sentencing guidelines, what they particularly say about what counts to get those numbers that, you know, correspond with a range of years. I'm not sure, but it can still be put in the sentencing recommendations if it's not reached a conviction yet as something to consider. And like you said, the judge has a broad leeway to take these things into account or not. You've seen them make downward departures because somebody is older. You've seen them make downward departures because someone's younger. You've seen them make upward departures because of maybe a previous crime that was thrown out by a pardon, but, you know, not technically convicted. So, I mean, all of these things can play a role. But, you know, as far as the sentencing guidelines go, it'll be mentioned, but to put in the calculation, you know, then that's the reason there's a range in the sentencing guidelines.
That's right.
So that they can say, well, the range is 20 to 30 years, but because he's got 4 other pending criminal things, we'd like to say 27, you know, instead of in the middle.
That's exactly right. That's where the range comes in. That's why the sentencing guidelines, despite whatever the calculation is, it's only advisory. It's not controlling. So yeah, there's a lot of room there, intentionally so, to factor in things like this. Yep.
And we still have more to go down in Georgia. We'll see what happens there. We'll be covering the federal cases here. We'll be covering Pete Strzok and I will cover the state cases over on Cleanup on Aisle 45, and we'll shove it all in the Daily Beans somehow. But thank you so much. This is 36 weeks it took to get the. I mean, we were waiting obviously for the classified documents case, but truly, honestly, the more important to democracy case here is the events leading up to and preceding the attempted coup by a former president. And we have the charges, and they're simple and they're straightforward. I think it's an open and shut case, and we'll see on August 28th when that trial will take place.
Yeah, that's right. As I said, one of the most important cases clearly ever in the history of this country's experience with the criminal justice system, and one that deserves the nation's attention. And it's been a long time coming, a short time worked by Jack Smith, but it's great that we have finally gotten to this point, and we're going to cover it very closely. And part of that coverage is going to include reading the indictment, just a straight up, not a dramatic retelling, just a straight up serious reading. We're going to do that, and we'll put that out for you to give you the opportunity to hear exactly what the prosecutors have alleged.
I assume most people listening to our program have probably read the indictment, but if you want to listen to it, that's going to be great. But this really, the reason I wanted to do this is for the folks who listen to this program who have people, family, friends in their lives who might not have the time to read the indictment fully. They can just listen to it. So you can send it to everybody in your email list, everybody that you know, put it on your social media. We're counting on you all to spread the word and get this as many ears or eyes on this indictment as possible. The American people need to know what's in it. So we appreciate your help with that. And of course, we'll be back next week, but you can look for that dramatic reading here in the next day or two if it doesn't drop on the same day that this episode drops. So thank you very much to everyone for listening. We will keep you informed on these charges. There probably will be superseding stuff, so stay tuned. We'll be back next week. I'm Allison Gill.
And I'm Andy McCabe.
We'll see you then. MSW Media.